October 19, 1941. Position: 53 degrees north, 26 degrees west. Depth: 47 meters beneath a sea the color of hammered iron. Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Bleichroth, commander of U-48, raised his periscope for exactly 4 seconds, long enough to count the masts. He was looking at Convoy SC, 4837 merchant vessels wallowing through force 8 winds, their smoke columns merging into a single black bruise on the horizon. Bleichroth allowed himself a slow, satisfied breath. The convoy was protected, technically. 3 Royal Canadian Navy corvettes, HMCS Moosejaw, HMCS Shadiac, and HMS Gladiolus, circled the perimeter like tired sheepdogs. They were slow. They had rudimentary ASDIC sonar that struggled to hold contact in the Atlantic swell. And there were only 3 of them guarding 37 ships. Bleichroth did not feel fear. He felt impatience. Look at them. They send merchant sailors to sea with a corvette and a prayer. The British are committing murder against their own people. Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Bleichroth, U-48 War Diary, October 19, 1941. He was not entirely wrong. SC-48 would lose 7 ships that night, 46,237 gross registered tons of war material sent to the ocean floor, 1,000 barrels of aviation fuel, hundreds of tons of steel, the bodies of 21 merchant sailors who would never reach Liverpool. It was, by the standards of 1941, a routine night in the Atlantic. The U-boats called this period the Glückliche Zeit, the happy time. But Bleichroth did not note something in his diary. He did not record a small, unremarkable detail visible through his periscope. On the bridge of the lead merchant ship, the British Commodore, Rear Admiral William Forsyth, was writing in his own log. And the word he wrote was not despair, he wrote more. More ships were coming, more escorts, more technology, more of everything. The Americans were building. And the Germans, staring through periscopes at what they believed was a dying empire, had absolutely no idea. To understand why the Battle of the Atlantic nearly ended the war before it truly began, you have to understand what the U-boat was, not simply a submarine, but the most sophisticated instrument of economic strangulation ever constructed. And the man who built his strategy around it was Karl Dönitz, a compact, precise Prussian officer who in 1935 was handed command of a submarine arm that existed on paper and nowhere else. Dönitz was 53 years old when the war began. He had spent his early career in U-boats in the First World War and had watched Imperial Germany come within weeks of starving Britain into submission before American convoys and anti-submarine tactics blunted the knife. He had spent 2 decades thinking about why that had failed. His conclusion was singular: not enough U-boats, operating in isolation, attacking at the wrong time. His solution was the Rudel tactic, the wolf pack. Instead of individual submarines hunting alone, Dönitz envisioned coordinated groups of 8 to 20 boats, directed by radio from his headquarters at Lorient, then Paris, then Berlin, vectored onto convoys like fingers of a closing fist. The lead boat shadowed and reported. The others converged on the surface at night, where ASDIC sonar was blind, and attacked from multiple vectors simultaneously. Escort commanders, designed around the threat of a single submerged submarine, were entirely unprepared for this. The Type 7C, the workhorse of the U-boat fleet, was a masterpiece of engineering parsimony. Displacing 871 tons surfaced, 1,070 tons submerged, she carried 14 torpedoes in 5 tubes, 4 forward, 1 aft. Her MAN diesel engines produced 2,800 shaft horsepower, giving 17.7 knots on the surface. Submerged, her electric motors dropped her to 7.6 knots, with battery endurance of roughly 80 miles before she was forced to surface and recharge. She had a crew of 52 men. She smelled, always, of diesel oil mildew and unwashed bodies in a steel tube the length of a tennis court. Oberleutnant Werner Hartenstein, who would go on to command U-156, described his first time diving a Type 7 in 1940. You understand immediately that the boat is alive. She breathes, she groans, every weld speaks to you under pressure. She is not comfortable. She is not safe, but she is fast, and she is invisible, and right now those are the only 2 things that matter. By September 1939, Dönitz had 57 operational U-boats. He needed 300 to guarantee the blockade of Britain. Hitler, still believing the war would be short, had not prioritized them. But what Dönitz lacked in numbers, he compensated with ferocity. In the first 6 months of the war, U-boats sank 201 Allied vessels, totaling 756,000 gross tons. These were not warships. They were grain carriers, oil tankers, ammunition ships. The circulatory system of a maritime empire that needed 55 million tons of imports per year simply to keep its population fed and its factories running. The British Admiralty had expected submarine warfare in 1939. What they had not expected was the scale, the coordination, or the utter indifference to their countermeasures. Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, First Sea Lord, wrote in his private diary in November 1939, "We are losing the argument on the surface of the sea. The U-boat arm is more dangerous than in 1917. I do not know how to stop them yet." The U-boat commanders of 1940 and 1941 were not supermen. They were young, technically brilliant, and operating with a tactical framework that their enemy had not yet learned to counter. Their names became known in Germany the way fighter pilot aces were known: Gunther Prien, who sank the battleship HMS Royal Oak inside Scapa Flow; Joachim Schepke, Otto Kretschmer. These were the knights of the deep, their faces on magazine covers, their iron crosses awarded by Hitler in personal ceremony. October 1940 was the summit. In a single week, October 17 through 24th, Convoy SC-7 and Convoy HX-79 were savaged by a wolfpack of 9 U-boats, led by Prien, Schepke, and Kretschmer. 32 ships sank, 154,661 tons of cargo. The escort, 2 sloops and 2 corvettes, was simply overwhelmed. Convoy Commodore Vice Admiral Lachlan Mackinnon, who survived the destruction of SC-7 aboard the Swedish steamer Calliope, wrote in his after-action report with the controlled anguish of a man trying to remain professional in the face of catastrophe. "We are not yet capable of defending these convoys against coordinated night attack. The enemy comes in on the surface, inside ASDIC range, and is invisible until he fires. I cannot tell you what to do about this. I can only tell you it is happening and it will continue to happen." The Germans tracked their kill ratios obsessively. In June 1941 alone, U-boats sank 61 ships, 310,143 gross tons, for the loss of just 4 submarines. That was a kill ratio of roughly 15 to 1. At that rate, Britain could not survive mathematically. Churchill, in a memo marked "Most Secret" and circulated only to his war cabinet, wrote the sentence that would define his private terror throughout the war: "The Battle of the Atlantic is the dominating factor in the war." He was not speaking metaphorically. If the Atlantic lifeline was cut, there was no D-Day, No. 8th Air Force bombing from English bases, no Lend-Lease pipeline of Sherman tanks and P-51 Mustangs. Britain would either negotiate or starve. Dönitz understood this perfectly. His war diary entries from this period carry an almost academic quality. He is solving a logistics equation, not conducting a moral crusade. The Allied convoys to the U-boat commanders were simply targets, slow, predictable, funneled by ocean geography and weather systems into corridors that a competent signals intelligence operation could read in advance. The Germans called the convoy routes Lebensadern, the arteries of life. They were trying to sever them, and in 1941 they were succeeding. Korvettenkapitän Erik Topp, commanding U-552, sent this signal to U-boat command after sinking his 12th ship in September 1941. "The American destroyer Escort is not looking for us. They are driving past us in the dark. I fired from 800 meters, surfaced. No pursuit. These convoys are open." But there were things the U-boat commanders were not reporting to Dönitz because they did not know them themselves. They did not know that in Washington, D.C., a program of industrial mobilization had begun that would ultimately produce 5,777 merchant ships in 4 years, more than 1 new Liberty ship every single day. They did not know that in the shipyards of Portland, Maine, Savannah, Georgia, and Richmond, California, women who had never welded before were learning to assemble 14 245-ton hulls in 17 days flat. They did not know that the Atlantic Gap, the mid-ocean dead zone where no land-based aircraft could reach, was about to be closed. Commander Frederick John Walker, Royal Navy, was not celebrated in 1941. He had been passed over for promotion twice, considered too aggressive and insufficiently diplomatic for peacetime naval culture. The war rescued him. Given command of the sloop HMS Stork and Escort Group 36 in late 1941, Walker spent his evenings developing what he called the creeping attack, a method of holding continuous ASDIC contact on a submerged U-boat while a second escort crept slowly overhead at minimum speed, its propellers silent enough not to mask the detonation of depth charges dropped by the trailing sloop. December 17 through 19, 1941. Convoy HG, 76, 42 merchant ships escorted by Walker's Group, 36 including the escort carrier HMS Audacity. The Germans sent a wolfpack of 8 boats. What happened next was not a battle, it was an education. U-131 was the first to die, caught on the surface by Audacity's Martlet fighters, and then depth-charged by Stork. Then U-434. Then U-567, commanded by Engelbert Endras, one of Germany's top aces. With 25 ships to his name, Walker's Group also lost HMS Audacity and 2 merchant ships. But the ratio had reversed. 3 U-boats sunk, 2 merchant ships lost. Dönitz, reading the battle analysis at Lorient, wrote in his war diary, "This convoy battle must be considered a German failure. The enemy has developed new tactics and new technology that are not yet understood. We must determine what happened before we commit further forces in this manner." What had happened was this. HMS Audacity had happened. The escort carrier, a crude conversion of a captured German merchant ship with a flat deck, 12 aircraft, and no armor, had changed the fundamental geometry of the Atlantic battle. For the first time, the mid-ocean was no longer the U-boat's exclusive domain. Aerial eyes could now range ahead of convoys, forcing the shadowing U-boats to dive, and diving made the submarines slow. A slow submarine could not keep pace with a 12-knot convoy. The wolfpack's fundamental advantage, the ability to track, report position, and vector in reinforcements, was suddenly contestable. It was the first hint of what was coming, but only a hint. The Germans adjusted. They requested longer-range aircraft from the Luftwaffe. They developed the Metox radar detector, which could pick up British metric band radar emissions and alert crews before detection. They asked for more boats. They were still sinking ships at a catastrophic rate. In 1942, driven partly by the American entry into the war creating a briefly undefended American coastal zone, U-boats sank 8,245,000 gross tons. It was the worst single year of the entire war. And yet inside those numbers, if you knew where to look, a different story was forming. Allied shipbuilding produced 7.1 million gross tons in 1942. For the first time, construction was approaching pace with destruction. The arithmetic was shifting, one Liberty ship at a time. May 5, 1943, Oberleutnant Herbert Werner, first watch officer aboard U-230, was standing on the bridge at midnight when the sky lit up. Not from flares, from radar. The Allies had installed a new centimetric band radar, the Type 271M, operating at 9.7 GHz, a frequency that Metox could not detect at all. Werner did not know this. He knew only that a Sunderland flying boat appeared from absolute darkness and dropped a pattern of Mark 2000 Fido homing torpedoes that drove straight for U-230's propeller noise. Werner crash-dived to 140 meters. The Fido lost the scent at 60 meters. It was designed to hunt at depth, but its active sonar had a flaw. They survived. Barely. When Werner surfaced 3 hours later and reported to U-boat command, he tried to explain what had happened. The aircraft had found them in complete darkness, without any radar warning whatsoever. U-boat command's response was blunt and inadequate. Cause of detection unclear. Continue operations. What was happening above him during those 3 submerged hours was the second half of the story. Convoy, ONS, 5, 43 merchant ships escorted by Captain Peter Gretton's escort group B7, comprising 1 destroyer and 5 corvettes, was being attacked by 30 U-boats simultaneously. 30. the largest wolfpack ever assembled. And the convoy was not dying, it was fighting back. HMS Duncan, Gretton's destroyer, maintained ASDIC contact on 4 separate submarines simultaneously. The corvette HMCS Bittersweet rammed U-438 at 17 knots and killed her outright. HMS Pelican tracked U-438 sister boat U-630 for 6 hours through deteriorating weather and finally killed her with a pattern of 10 depth charges set to detonate between 80 and 140 meters. HMS Pink, a single-flower-class corvette with a complement of 85 men, single-handedly shepherded 6 straggling merchant ships around the flank of the pack, reaching port with all 6 intact. By the morning of May 6, Convoy ONS 5 had lost 12 merchant ships, but the 30 U-boats attacking it had lost 7 of their own number. In the calculus of the Atlantic War, this was catastrophic for Germany. 7 submarines represented 7 years of steel, 350 trained men, and an irreplaceable investment of expertise. Dönitz read the morning signals at his headquarters in Berlin with what his aide, Korvettenkapitän Hans Meckel, later described as very long silence. Dönitz wrote in his war diary, "The situation in the Atlantic is very serious. The enemy has mastered the submarine threat in a way I did not believe possible in this time frame. Our losses in May cannot be sustained. 43 U-boats were sunk in May 1943 alone." Dönitz called it Bloody May. He did not use that phrase publicly, but he did the only rational thing. On May 24, 1943, he withdrew his entire Wolfpack force from the North Atlantic. For the first time in 4 years, the main convoy routes were free of coordinated U-boat attack. The German submariners had a different name for this period. They called it Die Katastrophe. Herbert Werner survived the war. He wrote a book. He called it Iron Coffins. The title was not literary. In 1943 alone, 237 U-boats were destroyed. Of the 40,000 men who served in the U-boat arm, 28,000 never came home. The survival rate for U-boat crews in 1943 was less than 1 in 4. Every time I surfaced in 1943, I was surprised to be alive, not relieved. Surprised, it no longer felt like fighting, it felt like dying at different speeds. Oberleutnant Herbert Werner, U-230, Iron Coffins, 1969. The reversal of the Atlantic battle was not a single event. It was a layering of technical and tactical solutions, each one closing a gap that the U-boats had exploited. Understanding the victory requires understanding the tools, because the men who wielded them, on both sides, were brave. What separated them ultimately was not courage, it was the assembly line. The first layer was radar, the British Type 271M centimetric radar, introduced in early 1943. Operated on a 9.7 centimeter wavelength that the German Metox detector, tuned for metric band frequencies, simply could not register. A U-boat on the surface at night believed it was invisible. The 271M could detect a U-boat conning tower at 9 miles in calm conditions, 12 miles in good conditions. When the Sunderland or Liberator appeared from absolute darkness and dropped its weapons without any preceding warning signal, U-boat commanders initially assumed informers in port. Some requested investigations into their own crews. It was not informers, it was physics. The second layer was the HFDF system, high-frequency direction finding, nicknamed HFDF. Every time a U-boat transmitted a report to U-boat command, the signal was intercepted by a network of shore-based and, crucially, ship-mounted HFDF receivers. 2 or more bearings gave a crossfix accurate to within 25 miles. This meant that the U-boat's greatest tactical asset, radio coordination, had become a tracking beacon. Every signal Dönitz sent vectoring his boats onto a convoy also told the Allies precisely where those boats were. Oberleutnant Hans-Joachim Kettner, a signals officer attached to U-boat command headquarters in Berlin, wrote in his private papers after the war, "We knew the transmissions were risky. Dönitz believed the tactical advantage of coordination was worth the risk of direction finding. But by 1943 the risk had grown beyond calculation. Every time we spoke, we were telling them where to look." The third layer was the escort carrier, the USS Bogue, an auxiliary aircraft carrier converted from a Maritime Commission C-3 cargo hull, entered North Atlantic service in January 1943 with 28 aircraft, 12 Grumman TBF Avengers, and 16 FM2 Wildcats. She was not a fleet carrier. She was unarmored, slow at 17 knots, and her pilots flew in weather conditions that would have grounded peacetime training exercises. But she closed the mid-ocean air gap, the 600-mile zone between Newfoundland, Greenland, and Iceland, where land-based aircraft could not reach. The U-boat crews called escort carriers sargassum, the sargasso seaweed that clogs and entangles. The nickname began as derisive. By August 1943, USS Bogue alone had sunk or assisted in sinking 9 U-boats. The joke stopped. The fourth layer was ultra. The breaking of the German naval Enigma codes at Bletchley Park gave Allied convoy routing authorities access to U-boat command's operational signals with a latency of sometimes as little as 6 hours. Convoys were routed around known wolfpack concentrations. U-boats were met not by unguarded merchants, but by reinforced escort groups that had been specifically vectored to intercept. German commanders found convoys disappearing from predicted positions, reappearing unexpectedly, seemingly guided by an intelligence source no one could identify. Vice-Admiral Friedrich Ruger, German Navy, said in a post-war interview in 1956, "The enemy knew our intentions before we acted on them ourselves. It was as if they were reading Dönitz's mind. We investigated sabotage, informants, everything. The truth was incomprehensible to us until after the war. Depth charges, hedgehog, and the science of killing submarines. To the men on both sides, the mechanics of killing in the Atlantic were intimate in a way that aerial combat rarely was. A bomber crew dropped their ordnance and turned for home. An escort group hunting a U-boat could spend 12 hours in contact, listening to the submarine moving beneath them, through the ASDIC speaker, a pinging, metallic heartbeat that told you whether your enemy was turning, rising, going deeper. The standard British depth charge of 1939 contained 290 pounds of minol, high explosive, in a cast-iron canister, set to detonate at a preset depth by a hydrostatic pistol. A pattern of 10 charges arranged in a diamond across the suspected submarine's track could generate lethal hydrostatic pressure within 15 feet of the hull. The ASDIC operator would lose contact during the attack. The explosions and turbulence masked the echo, and the crew would wait for what came up afterward. Oil. Debris, sometimes nothing, which was the worst outcome. The submarine had gone deeper or turned during the blind period, and the pattern had hit empty water. The Hedgehog changed everything. Introduced in 1942, the Hedgehog was a 24-spigot head-throwing mortar that fired a pattern of contact-fused projectiles in an ellipse 130 feet wide and 140 feet long, landing 200 yards ahead of the ship, precisely where ASDIC contact remained unbroken during the throw. Each projectile contained 35 pounds of Torpex explosive, 50% more powerful by weight than TNT. If even one hit, it detonated. If none hit, they sank harmlessly. No explosions, no turbulence. ASDIC contact maintained. A miss revealed nothing. A hit killed instantly. The psychological effect on U-boat crews of hearing the Hedgehog pattern enter the water above them was described by Matrosennoberger Freiter Klaus Herold, a hydrophone operator aboard U-549 who survived as a prisoner of war. You hear 24 splashes, very fast, like rain on a roof. And then silence. And in that silence, every man is looking at the ceiling of the pressure hull and praying to God that none of them touches us. The silence lasts perhaps 4 seconds. Then either we are alive or we are not. I do not know how to explain what those 4 seconds feel like. The Hedgehog was complemented in 1944 by the Squid, a 3-barreled mortar firing full-size depth charges in a triangular pattern timed to explode simultaneously at the submarine's depth, automatically calculated from ASDIC. The Squid's kill probability per attack was 37%, compared to 7% for conventional depth charges. Once a Squid-equipped escort gained contact, the submarine's survival odds were roughly comparable to those of a man playing Russian roulette, with a pistol holding 3 chambers loaded. The Mark 24 Fido air-launched acoustic homing torpedo entered service in April 1943. It was 84 inches long, weighed 680 pounds, ran at 12 knots, homed on propeller noise, and had a lethal radius of approximately 6 meters on contact detonation. Between 1943 and 1945, Fido torpedoes were responsible for 24 confirmed U-boat kills and 15 additional probable sinkings. U-boat commanders who survived a Fido attack reported the sound of it in the water, a high, keening drone that grew louder and then, for the survivors, stopped. For the unlucky ones, it did not stop. The factory as a weapon, the fundamental asymmetry of the Battle of the Atlantic, was not tactical. It was industrial. And it was American. The United States Maritime Commission, under the direction of Rear Admiral Emory Scott Land, launched the emergency shipbuilding program in January 1941, 11 months before Pearl Harbor, with a target of 200 new cargo vessels by the end of 1942. By the end of 1943, they had built 2,700. By the end of the war, 5,777 vessels, totaling 56.9 million gross tons. The Liberty ship was not a beautiful vessel. Naval architects who saw the design called it the ugly duckling. She was 441 feet long, displaced 14,245 tons fully laden, and cruised at 11 knots. She was built to a welded rather than riveted hull, which meant she could be assembled in sections and joined. She carried a crew of 44 merchant mariners and a naval armed guard of 25. She could carry 10,800 tons of cargo, tanks, aircraft, food, fuel, ammunition, or any combination thereof. The Kaiser shipbuilding yards at Richmond, California, 4 shipways on San Francisco Bay, were the cathedral of this industrial crusade. Henry J. Kaiser had never built a ship before the war. He had built dams. He applied dam-building logic, prefabricated sections, parallel assembly tracks, continuous shifts, to Liberty ship construction and shattered every record in maritime history. By November 1942, Kaiser's yard launched the SS Robert E. Peary in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel laying to christening. The actual operational construction time was 17 days. But even 17 days meant that a U-boat's torpedo, which took 7 years of German industrial investment to deliver, was being answered by 14,245 tons of American replacement capacity, roughly every 17 days per slipway, in 18 slipways operating simultaneously. The workforce was 43% female by 1944. She was Dorothy Johnson, welder, age 23, Richmond Yard No. 2, who welded 47 feet of hull seam per shift and went home to make dinner for her children. She was Vera Joyner, crane operator, who moved prefabricated deck sections weighing 40 tons with a precision her male predecessors admitted they could not match. They built ships in the dark. They built ships in the rain. They built ships because they understood, without being told the strategy, that the ships were winning. Dorothy Johnson, in an oral history interview in 1992, said, "We didn't know what was on the other end of what we were building, but we knew that if we stopped, something terrible would happen. So we didn't stop. Not one day. Each Liberty ship required 250,000 separate parts, 3,425 blueprints, 1 mile of welded seam per hull section, and 17,142 feet of electrical wiring. The steel alone, approximately 3,500 tons per vessel, was sourced from Pittsburgh mills, running triple shifts, 7 days a week, their furnace light visible from 10 miles. Against this, the U-boat arm was producing Type 7C submarines at a rate of roughly 15 to 20 per month by late 1943, from 3 primary yards: Blohm und Voss in Hamburg, Deschke Mag AG Weser in Bremen, and Germania Werft in Kiel. Each submarine required approximately 35,000 man-hours to construct. The Allied bombing campaign against these yards, combined with material shortages caused by the strategic blockade of German raw material imports, progressively degraded production schedules throughout 1943 and 1944. By the end of 1944, Germany was losing submarines faster than it could replace them, and replacing them with crews that had an average of 84 hours of operational training, compared to the 400 hours mandated by Dönitz's own pre-war doctrine. American naval pilot training, by contrast, averaged 300 flight hours before operational assignment, with escort carrier group pilots averaging an additional 90 hours of anti-submarine specific training. The men flying from the deck of USS Bogue in 1943 were, hour for hour, more thoroughly prepared than the men diving away from them. The numbers of the Battle of the Atlantic are not comfortable to read. They were not comfortable to compile. The convoy statistics maintained by the Allied Anti-Submarine Survey Board represent 4 years of death, both Allied and German, rendered into columns that make strategic sense of what was, at the individual level, mostly drowning and fire. Between September 1939 and May 8, 1945, U-boats sank 2,779 Allied and neutral merchant vessels, totaling 14,573,000 gross registered tons. They killed 36,200 merchant seamen, men who were not military combatants, who received no combat pay, no medals, and who died at a higher casualty rate than any branch of the American armed forces in the war. They sank 175 Allied warships. They fired approximately 10,000 torpedoes in anger. In return, 783 German U-boats were destroyed by Allied action, representing 28,000 of the 40,000 men who served. Anti-submarine aircraft accounted for 246 confirmed kills. Surface escorts accounted for 246. Shared credit accounted for 81. Mines, accidents, and other causes took the rest. The ratio of U-boat sailors killed to merchant sailors killed was approximately 3 to 4, meaning Germany's instrument of economic strangulation cost German lives almost as heavily as it cost Allied ones. The operational high watermark of the convoy system was Operation Neptune, the naval component of D-Day, June 6, 1944. Across the English Channel, 6,939 vessels of all types carried 132,715 men to the beaches of Normandy in a single day. Supplied by a logistical chain that reached back through unbroken Atlantic convoy routes to the factories and farms of North America. Not one vessel in the invasion fleet was sunk by a U-boat. Dönitz committed 36 boats to interdicting Operation Neptune. He lost 6 of them. He sank 1 destroyer, 1 corvette, 1 landing craft, and 4 merchant ships. General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, who had been placed in command of the Atlantic Wall defenses, wrote to his wife 3 weeks before D-Day, "If the enemy reaches the shore in strength, we cannot stop him. The sea lanes behind him are now his. He has supplies we cannot match. God help us if he comes in full force." The ground-level experience of Allied air and sea power in the final phase was described by Unteroffizier Rudolf Schmidt, a radio operator attached to the German Maritime Patrol Aircraft Command, where before we saw individual ships, spread and vulnerable, now we see columns and columns of ships, protected on all sides, with aircraft above them. You do not attack such a thing with a torpedo bomber. You do not attack such a thing at all. You report it and turn for home. What the U-boat crews learned to fear, there is a medical term for what the surviving U-boat crews developed: combat stress reaction. In the German Navy of 1943, there was no such terminology. There was duty, and there was failure to perform duty, and the space between them was where men broke. The U-boat service had the highest volunteer rate of any branch of the German armed forces at the war's outbreak. Nearly every crewman chose to be there. By 1943, replacement crews were being assigned, not recruited. The veterans who survived knew things that the replacements did not yet know. Primarily, what it sounded like when a hedgehog pattern landed in the water above you, and how long the silence lasted before you knew whether you were alive. Bootsman Wilhelm Dieker, who served 3 patrols aboard U-415 and survived the war as one of the statistically improbable minority, described a medical examination in Lorient in September 1943. The doctor asked me if I was sleeping. I told him, in bed, yes. In my mind, no. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the pinging. The ASDIC. It follows me home. It is with me on the street. It is the sound of being hunted. The German naval medical establishment documented a condition they called U-boot Herz, literally submarine heart, a psychosomatic syndrome involving palpitations, anxiety tremors, and hypervigilance to sound. It was diagnosed in approximately 15% of U-boat crewmen by 1944. The real number was likely higher. Diagnosis carried implications for duty assignment that veterans were reluctant to accept. The evolution of German intelligence assessments tells the story of a command trying to understand why it was losing. The U-boat Command War Diary entries, captured in their entirety after the war, show a progression from confidence through confusion to a kind of bewildered endurance. March 1943. Enemy convoy defenses have improved markedly. New radar type suspected but not confirmed. Losses unsustainable at current operational tempo. May 1943. North Atlantic operations suspended. Enemy employing centimetric radar and forward-throwing weapons of unknown type. 43 boats lost this month. Command cannot account for this rate of attrition from previous assessments. August 1943. Escort carriers confirmed as primary threat vector. Aircraft patrols now extend to mid-ocean gap. The operational advantage of surface transit is eliminated. January 1944. U-boat operations now primarily serve strategic purpose of tying down Allied anti-submarine forces. Sinking ratio has reversed against us. We continue by order. That last entry is the most important. We continue by order. By January 1944, U-boat command knew the battle was lost. They continued because surrender was not an option that Hitler's strategic culture permitted. The men who died in the Atlantic in 1944 and 1945 died in a campaign their own commanders had privately concluded was unwinnable. Conter-Admiral Eberhard Gott, Dönitz's chief of U-boat operations, testified at Nuremberg in 1946. We knew in the summer of 1943 that the Battle of the Atlantic was over. The technology had defeated us. The numbers had defeated us. We kept fighting because the alternative was to admit that 40,000 men had gone to sea for nothing. It was not rational. War rarely is. The survivors did not meet often. There was, in the years immediately after the war, a reluctance on both sides to revisit what had happened in the Atlantic. The merchant sailors who had been torpedoed had no veterans organizations, no parades, no benefits. They had survived a casualty rate higher than the Marine Corps at Iwo Jima, and they came home to civilian life in silence. Commander Frederick Johnny Walker, never saw the end. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage in Liverpool on July 9, 1944, worn out by years of continuous Atlantic convoy duty. He was 53 years old. His funeral was attended by thousands. He had sunk 23 U-boats in his career, more than any other Allied commander. His photograph hangs in the Battle of the Atlantic Memorial in Liverpool. Beneath it, the simple text, "He gave his life that we might live." Admiral Dönitz survived the war, was convicted of war crimes at Nuremberg, partly for the conduct of unrestricted submarine warfare, and served 10 years in Spandau prison. He was released in 1956. In 1958, he was interviewed by historian David Irving, who asked him when he knew the battle was unwinnable. Dönitz's answer was precise. May 24, 1943. When I withdrew the boats from the North Atlantic, I knew then, but I could not say it. You cannot tell 40,000 men that the thing they are dying for is already lost. Dr. Philip D., who led the team that developed the centimetric radar used to defeat the U-boats, received his knighthood quietly in 1946. He gave few interviews. In a letter to his colleague Professor Ratcliffe in 1952, he wrote, "We knew the physics before we knew the war. The wavelength was the thing. 9.7 centimeters. Everything else followed from that. The men who died while we found the right frequency. I think about them. Today, the U-505 rests in the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. The only Type 9C U-boat in existence, captured intact by USS Guadalcanal's hunter-killer group on June 4, 1944, in what remains the only boarding and capture of a foreign warship on the high seas by the U.S. Navy since 1815. She sits in a climate-controlled gallery, her pressure hull painted the original grey, her forward torpedo tubes still loaded with drill weapons. School children walk through her. They duck through the watertight hatches. They stand in the control room where the chief engineer watched the gauges during crash dives, where men spent months in a space smaller than a bus. The museum's audio guide, at the moment visitors enter the control room, plays the sound of an ASDIC ping. Just one. Then silence. Several veterans have reported, over the years, that upon hearing it, they have had to leave the exhibit. The Allied Anti-Submarine Survey Board's final interrogation report, compiled in August 1945 from interviews with 214 captured U-boat officers, contains the following entry, attributed to an unnamed Kapitan Leutnant his identity redacted at his own request. You ask me what I feared most. Not the depth charges. Those were fast. I feared the convoys themselves. You would sink one ship, and while it was still burning, you could see through the periscope the others closing their formation and sailing on. They did not stop. They never stopped. That is when I understood that we could not win. Not because of your weapons. Because of your indifference to loss. You simply replaced everything and kept moving forward. No German commander could answer that. Heinrich Bleichrodt, the man who opened this story, surfaced his periscope in October 1941 and saw 37 merchant ships, and believed he was looking at a dying empire. He was wrong by approximately 14 million tons of shipping, 2 million trained sailors, 5,777 Liberty ships, 900 escort vessels, 43 aircraft carriers of all classes, and the entire industrial output of a continent that had decided, with characteristic American immodesty, that losing was not something it was prepared to do. The grey Atlantic is still cold. The wrecks are still down there, merchant ships and U-boats both, lying in water too deep and too dark for salvage, their cargo still in the holds, their crews still inside them. 28,000 German submariners, 36,200 merchant sailors. The numbers are carved into memorials in Liverpool, in Halifax, in Washington, in Lorient. The convoy routes are still there too. Shipping still crosses the North Atlantic on the same corridors that Dönitz tried to close. Tankers, container ships, bulk carriers, the direct descendants of the Liberty ships, cross in both directions every day, faster than the submarines that hunted their grandparents, guided by GPS where their grandfathers navigated by stars, and carrying enough cargo in a single modern vessel to fill a convoy of 1943 merchant ships with room to spare. They do not stop. They have never stopped. And every time a container ship passes over the Rockall Bank where SC7 died, or the Grand Banks where convoy HX 229 was savaged, or the mid-ocean rendezvous point west of 30 degrees, where the air gap once yawned open like a wound, it is crossing water that was bought with a price no ledger can fully record. Karl Dönitz believed the ocean was his. He was wrong. It belonged to the men who died crossing it, and the men and women who built the ships to replace them, and the escorts who kept faith with the merchants they were sworn to protect. The happy time ended. It ended because of radar, and depth charges, and hedgehog mortars, and escort carriers, and centimetric wavelengths, and Bletchley Park codebreakers, and women who welded in the dark in Richmond, California. But mostly it ended because the convoys, battered, burning, losing ships off their flanks like blood from a wound, just kept moving.